Hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive. We're diving into a topic today that I think we've all got some strong opinions on, right? I mean, who hasn't had experience with peer assessment at some point in their education?
It's definitely one of those things that can spark some pretty lively debates about what works best in the classroom.
Exactly. But today, we're not just relying on gut feelings or anecdotes. We're going straight to the research to uncover what the evidence actually says about the impact of peer assessment. Specifically, its impact on how well students actually learn.
And to do that, we've got a really solid source to work with. A meta-analysis that was published in the Educational Psychology Review, June 2020, I believe.
Oh, a meta-analysis. Okay, so for anyone who's not familiar with the term, that means we're not just looking at one single study here.
Right. A meta-analysis is basically like a super study. It combines data from lots of individual studies to get a bigger, more comprehensive picture of what's going on. And this particular meta-analysis looked at a whopping 54 studies on peer assessment.
Wow, 54. That's a pretty significant chunk of research to draw from.
It is. It really gives us a good bird's eye view of the landscape of peer assessment research.
So, for you, our listener, our mission today is crystal clear. We want to find out if having students assess each other's work actually leads to better learning. And if it does, what are the conditions that make it work best?
Because I think we all have a sense that there's something powerful about students learning from each other. But does the science back that up?
Right. Okay, so before we dive into the findings, let's make sure we're all on the same page about what exactly peer assessment is, according to this body of research. What did they say?
Well, they define it pretty straightforwardly as students assessing or being assessed by each other, but with a key element. There has to be communication of feedback that's relevant to whatever the task is.
So it's not just like, hey, read my essay and tell me if it's good or bad.
No, it's more focused than that. It's about giving feedback that will actually help the other person improve their work. And that feedback can be written, verbal, it can even happen online.
Ah, okay. So there's actually a lot of different ways to do peer assessment.
Exactly. And the researchers were also very careful to distinguish between peer assessment as a method, like the process itself, and the feedback, which is the actual content being shared.
Right, so one is the how and the other is the what.
Precisely.
And I think it's also interesting that you could be on either side of that equation, right? You could be the one giving the assessment or the one receiving it.
Absolutely. And in fact, the researchers point out that there might be some added benefits for students who get to experience both roles.
Yeah, I can see how that would make you think more deeply about the criteria for good work and how to give constructive feedback.
Exactly. So it's not just about helping others, it's also about helping yourself learn.
Okay, so we've got a good handle on what peer assessment is. Now let's get to the juicy stuff. What did this huge pile of studies reveal about its impact on student learning? Does it actually move the needle for you?
Well, the headline is a definite yes. Across those 54 studies, they found a small to medium positive effect of peer assessment on academic performance.
Okay, so not like a magic bullet, but definitely a positive influence. Can you give us the numbers on that?
Sure, statistically speaking, it was a G of 0.31, and the p-value was less than 0.001.
Okay, for those of us who aren't statisticians, what's that actually mean?
Basically, it means that the findings are statistically significant. That tiny p-value tells us there's a very, very small chance that those positive results just happened by fluke.
Ah, okay, so we can be pretty confident that peer assessment actually does make a difference. Now, I'm curious, how did it compare to other ways of evaluating student work, like, the traditional teacher assessment?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting because they looked at a few different comparisons. First, they compared peer assessment to situations where there was no formal assessment at all. And in those cases, peer assessment definitely came out on top with a significant positive effect.
Right, which makes sense. Any feedback is probably better than no feedback.
Exactly, but then they did a really key comparison for you. Peer assessment versus the good old-fashioned teacher assessment. And guess what? They found that peer assessment also had a significant positive effect, even compared to the teacher doing the grading.
Hold on, so you're telling me that students evaluating each other can be just as good as, or even better than, the teacher doing it? That's kind of mind-blowing. I mean, for you, our listener, this could mean less time spent grading papers every night, right?
It definitely challenges some assumptions, doesn't it? It could be huge for you.
It does. So why might that be the case? Why would peer assessment sometimes outperform teacher assessment?
That's the million-dollar question. The meta-analysis doesn't give us a definitive answer, but it does suggest a few possibilities. One is that students might use language that's more relatable to their peers, making the feedback easier to understand and act on.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like if another student tells me my essay is boring, that's going to hit harder than if my teacher says it's lacking in engaging prose.
Right. Or another possibility is that there's less pressure when you're being evaluated by your peers compared to the sometimes intimidating authority figure of the teacher.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. It's always scarier to get feedback from the person who's holding the grade book.
Exactly. And one more thing they looked at was peer assessment compared to self-assessment, where you're basically grading your own work.
Ah, interesting. So how did that shake out?
Well, in that comparison, they didn't find a significant difference. So it seems like getting feedback from someone else, whether it's a peer or a teacher, is generally more effective than just relying on your own judgment.
Makes sense. Two heads are better than one and all that. So it sounds like peer assessment really holds its own against other assessment methods and even has some unique advantages.
Absolutely.
But we also know that what works in one situation might not work in another. So what did the researchers find out about the factors that might influence how well peer assessment works? Like, did certain things make it more or less effective?
Yeah, they definitely looked into that. They examined a bunch of different characteristics to see if they moderated or changed the effectiveness of peer assessment. And I think this is where the meta-analysis becomes particularly valuable because it allows us to see those patterns across the wide range of studies.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's walk through some of those moderating factors. First up, education level. Did it matter if the students were in primary school, secondary school, or higher education?
hmm
Did peer assessment have a bigger impact at certain ages or stages of learning?
Well, that's the interesting thing. Overall, they didn't find a statistically significant difference between those different educational levels. So it seems like peer assessment can be beneficial across the board for learners of all ages.
Okay, so it's not like it's a magical solution for elementary school, but useless in college.
Right. However, they did observe some trends that are worth noting. The effect sizes were a bit higher for secondary students with a G of 0.44 and primary students with a G of 0.41, compared to tertiary students where the G was 0.21.
So maybe it has a slightly stronger impact in those earlier years, but it's still valuable in higher education.
Interesting. What about the way peer assessment was actually conducted? Did the type of feedback matter, like written versus verbal?
Good question. They looked at that, and it's pretty interesting what they found. So written feedback, they found a positive effect whether or not written feedback was included, and there wasn't a significant difference between those two conditions.
Okay, so having students write down their feedback didn't necessarily make it more effective.
Exactly. And the same thing was true for peer dialogues, actually having a conversation as part of the assessment process.
So both written and verbal feedback can be valuable.
It seems so. The key takeaway there might be that the act of engaging with each other's work, whether it's through words on paper or a face-to-face conversation, seems to be what really matters.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's about that active engagement, that back and forth. Now, what about when peer assessment involved assigning an actual grade? Did that change things? That's where things get a little bit more nuanced. So for tertiary students, those in higher education, including a grading component, was significantly beneficial. They found a G of 0.55 there.
Wow, so that's a pretty decent effect size.
It is. But here's the catch. It didn't show a significant benefit for primary or secondary students.
Really? That's surprising. Why do you think grades might matter more at the college level?
Well, one possibility the researchers suggested is that tertiary students might just be more attuned to grades. I mean, they're often thinking about GPAs and transcripts and all that, so maybe they take peer assessment more seriously when it actually results in a mark on their record.
Yeah, that makes sense. Plus, college courses are often structured differently, with grades playing a more central role.
Exactly. So the big takeaway here, especially for those of you working with younger learners, is that assigning grades in peer assessment might not be as crucial as the feedback itself. You can still get a lot of learning benefits from focusing on the dialogue and the written comments.
Right. It's about the process, not just the product. So what about structure? Did it matter if students were given specific guidelines or rubrics for their feedback, or if they were allowed to give more free-form feedback?
Good question. They looked at that too and found that both approaches were effective. So using structured methods like providing rubrics showed positive effects, And allowing for more free-form feedback, where students could kind of express themselves more organically, also showed positive effects.
Okay, so both can work. Did they have a preference for one over the other?
Well, interestingly, there wasn't a significant difference in their effectiveness. However, it is worth noting that the meta-analysis included fewer studies that used purely free-form assessment.
So there's maybe a bit less data on that side of things.
Exactly. But the takeaway for educators is that both approaches have potential. So you can choose what works best for your students and your particular learning goals.
Okay, that's good to know. Now, with so many learning environments shifting online, I'm curious, did the researchers look at whether peer assessment worked differently in online versus offline settings?
They did, and what they found was that both online and offline peer assessment showed positive effects. Online peer assessment had a G of 0.38, and offline peer assessment had a G of 0.24, and there wasn't a statistically significant difference between the two.
So whether you're in a traditional classroom or a virtual one, peer assessment can be a valuable tool. That's good news.
It is. It speaks to the flexibility of peer assessment. And I think that's really important for educators to know because it means you don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel just because the learning environment has changed.
Absolutely. Now, another aspect of peer assessment that often comes up is anonymity. Did the researchers find that it was better for students to give their feedback anonymously?
Well, this is where it gets a bit counterintuitive. You might think that anonymity would lead to more honest and critical feedback, but the findings actually suggest otherwise. Both anonymous and identified peer assessment showed positive effects, and there was no significant difference between them.
Huh, that is surprising. I would have thought that people would be more likely to hold back if they knew their name was attached to the feedback.
It's a common assumption, but this meta-analysis challenges that. It suggests that other factors might play a bigger role in the quality and honesty of the feedback, like the classroom culture, or how well students are trained in giving constructive criticism.
That's fascinating. So anonymity might not be the make or break factor that some people think it is.
Exactly. Now, another aspect they looked at was frequency. So does it matter how often peer assessment happens? Is it better to do it once or multiple times throughout a course?
Well, my intuition would say that the more practice students get with both giving and receiving feedback, the better they'll become at it, and the more benefits they'll reap.
And the data seems to back that up. When peer assessment was done multiple times, the effect size was a positive G of 0.37. But when it was only done once, the effect wasn't statistically significant.
Ah, so repeated exposure seems to be key.
It does appear that way. It's kind of like any skill, right? The more you practice, the better you get at it.
Absolutely. Okay, one last piece of the puzzle. The relationship between the task that's being assessed and the ultimate measure of the student's learning, what researchers call transfer. What did they find there?
Great question. They looked at a few different types of transfer. So first, there's near transfer, where the task being assessed is very similar to the final measure of performance.
So like if you're assessing a rough draft of an essay, and then the final grade is based on the final version of that same essay.
Exactly. Then there's far transfer, where the assessed task is more different from the final measure.
So maybe you're assessing a presentation on a specific historical event, but then the final exam covers a broader range of historical topics.
Right. And they also looked at what they called no transfer, where the assessment and the final measure were basically the same thing, but maybe with some revisions in between based on the feedback.
Okay, got it. So what did they find about these different types of transfer?
Well, near transfer showed the strongest effect, with a G of 0.42. Far transfer and no transfer also showed positive effects, but those weren't significantly different from each other.
So it seems like peer assessment is particularly effective when it's closely aligned with the ultimate learning goals. But it can still have benefits even when there's less direct alignment.
Exactly. It suggests that peer assessment doesn't just help students improve on that one specific task, but it can also help them develop skills and insights that they can apply to other related tasks.
That's really encouraging.
Yeah.
Okay, last question on these moderating factors. The role of the student. Does it matter if they're the one giving the feedback, receiving it, or, as is often the case, doing both?
That's an interesting one. Unfortunately, because most of the studies included in the meta-analysis looked at situations where students were both assessors and assessee, there wasn't enough data to draw any firm conclusions about the isolated impact of each role.
Ah, so we need more research that specifically focuses on those separate roles.
We do. However, it is worth mentioning that some individual studies, though not this meta-analysis itself, have suggested that the act of assessing someone else's work might be particularly beneficial.
Yeah, I can see how that would force you to really think critically about the criteria for good work.
Exactly. It kind of puts you in the teacher's shoes, which can be a powerful learning experience.
It can. Okay, so this meta-analysis has given us a lot to chew on about peer assessment. But even with such a comprehensive review, I'm sure there are some limitations to what it can tell us.
Oh, absolutely. It's important to remember that a meta-analysis can point us in the right direction and show us the big picture, but it can't necessarily explain all the nuances of why peer assessment works or doesn't work in every single situation.
Right, because every classroom is different, every group of students is different.
Hmm.
So what are some of the key limitations to keep in mind?
Well, one is that this meta-analysis doesn't definitively tell us the mechanisms behind peer assessment's effectiveness. It can show us that it works, but it doesn't always tell us exactly why.
So more research is needed to unpack those underlying processes.
Definitely. And another limitation is that many of the studies included in the meta-analysis weren't true experiments. They didn't have that really tight control over all the variables that you'd ideally want in a scientific study.
So we need more rigorous experimental studies to really confirm these findings and tease out those causal relationships.
Exactly. And finally, it's important to remember that this meta-analysis looked at studies across a wide range of academic subjects and outcome measures. So there might be some subject-specific nuances that get lost in the big picture.
Right. What works for assessing writing skills might not work in the same way for assessing math skills.
Exactly. So there's always more to learn.
Always. Okay, so to wrap things up for our listener, what would you say are the key takeaways from this deep dive into the research on peer assessment?
I think the main message is that peer assessment overall is a really valuable tool that can have a positive impact on student learning. And that's true across different educational levels and learning environments.
Yeah, that's a big one. And I think that surprising finding about peer assessment, sometimes being even more effective than teacher assessment, is something that educators should really pay attention to. It definitely challenges some traditional assumptions.
It does. And from a practical standpoint, I think this meta-analysis gives educators the green light to confidently incorporate peer assessment into their teaching practices. There's solid evidence to support it. And the fact that factors like online versus offline or anonymous versus identified didn't seem to make a huge difference means that teachers have a lot of flexibility in how they design their peer assessment activities.
Absolutely. It's all about finding what works best for your students and your context.
Exactly. However, I do think it's worth being mindful of the role of grading, especially with younger students. And it also seems like providing multiple opportunities for peer assessment throughout a course might lead to greater learning benefits.
Right. It's about making it a regular part of the learning process, not just a one-time thing.
Precisely.
So, listener, as you reflect on these findings, how might you incorporate or refine peer assessment in your own learning or teaching practices? Think about those nuances around grading, the frequency of peer assessment activities, and how you can best align those activities with your specific learning goals. And if you're hungry for even more detail, I highly recommend checking out the original meta-analysis in the Educational Psychology Review. There's a wealth of information in there, and you can even explore the individual studies that they analyzed. Understanding the power of peer assessment is an ongoing journey, and it's an area that I think will continue to be really important for both educational research and practice. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.